But the Quran also ordered more traditional penalties, such as the amputation of limbs for stealing, although there is no evidence that Muhammad ever did this. Many of these punishments still form part of Sharia law today.
There was the practice of female infanticide in 7th century Arabia. So if you had a daughter, you didn't want to take care of a daughter for 13 or 15 years until someone was going to marry her, you'd toss her out in the desert and she would die. Muhammad put an end to that. Muhammad put an emphasis on helping orphans and widows. We would look at that and say, great, that's a great teaching. But certainly we find many teachings that we would consider barbaric by today's standards. Stoning of adulterers and adulteresses, chopping off body parts for those who steal things. These are certainly things that I would regard as backwards.
Today, because we are facing the West, because we are having a very narrow understanding, we come with something with the Sharia is how we are going to implement very narrow understanding of what a marriage is, of what punishment are. I think that this is not the way. And this is why I'm saying today, if I'm speaking about Sharia, I live in the West. And in the West we have laws where you and me, we are equal before law. This is my Sharia. This is where we have to come with a better, a deeper understanding of the very essence of Sharia.
Some Muslim states, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, base their entire legal system on Sharia law, with punishments that many regard as medieval in their brutality. So calls by Muslim extremists to introduce Sharia law in Europe and in Britain have led to street protests and the rise of political parties campaigning against what they see as the spread of Islamic influence.
This is the problem, that in the 21st century we still have nations who are beheading people, who are cutting the limbs of people, cutting the hands and feet. There are women today being stoned to death by the government for sexual violations, not for murder. It's not for a crime of taking someone else's life, and it's just the inhumane way of killing.
All these people who are stoning the people and just starting with punishment, they say this is Sharia. I say no, that's not Sharia. This is the way you are instrumentalizing religion for your own sake. I have one question. How have you been elected? Are you elected? Are you representing the people? Let me start with the first question, because you have no legitimacy, no way for you to implement this in the name of Islam if you are not legitimate. And many of the people who are doing and starting with this are not really elected, and they are not chosen by the people. So their own status is important. And then there is a second question. What about social justice? What about equal rights? What about education? Are you going to punish people without educating them? Is this Islam? No, Islam is starting with education. And as for the punishment, is another story. Don't start with the punishment, start with dignity and rights, not with punishment, because punishment is the way you instrumentalize religion just to make yourself being legitimate while you are not.
It was now 627 AD. Muhammad had a secure power base in Medina. Although he had frustrated all the efforts of his enemies, the Quraysh, to destroy him, they were still powerful and in control of Mecca. If Muhammad was to succeed in bringing his message to all the people of Arabia, he had to find a solution to break this stalemate. One of the key lessons from the battle for Muhammad was that he was going to find it very difficult to overcome the Meccans militarily. He had to try to undermine them politically. What he needed was to strike alliances with the other tribes across Arabia. And one of the key ways of doing this was through marriage. For Muhammad's critics, his polygamous marriages have always been a problem. But at that time in Arabia, polygamy was the norm. And it wasn't until after the death of his first wife that Muhammad had several wives at the same time. Some accounts say 9, others 11 or 13. Some were widows, some were women captured after battles who, by marrying him, were granted their freedom. One was even a Christian Coptic slave presented to him by the Byzantine ruler of Egypt. But his most controversial marriage was to the daughter of his closest companion, a young girl called Aisha. According to some sources, Aisha is supposed to have been betrothed at age 6 or 7, then formally married at 9. Other accounts make her older, nearly 16 or 17. It's this lack of clarity that has left Muhammad open to serious condemnation from many critics.
If you're a 53-year-old man and you take a 9-year-old girl into your bed and consummate the marriage, it is not right. Not only from the standpoint of 21st century morality of the Western world, but of what one might say natural morality of most societies most of the time.
My position on this is that she was older. She was between 16 and 18 and not 6 and 9. So these are, scholars of today, but not today, in fact, last century, trying to get the sense that might be. We are repeating this, but it's not really true. It's not something which is in the Quran, it's in the prophetic tradition, and we have to check about this. And I would say the age here is problematic in itself.
Muhammad's marriage to Aisha lasted till his death, and she later became a prominent political leader in her own right. Muslim historians claim that it was her differences with Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali that eventually led to the great schism in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia sects.
The real point in this, and that is lost in all this argument, is who was Aisha, what did she become? She grew up in the Prophet's household to become a really feisty, independent, intelligent, politically aware woman, and she is a foundation of our understanding of the Prophet's life. Without Aisha, half of what we know of the Prophet disappears.
A series of further revelations defined Islamic marriage. They also provided Muhammad's critics with more ammunition, as they said that while Muhammad was allowed to keep all his wives, in future, Muslim men would only be allowed a maximum of 4 wives, as long as they could support them and treat them all equally.
We have to understand the Prophet Muhammad in the context of his time. Pagan Arabia is a place where there is unlimited polygamy. That is the normal practice. Islam comes and limits that polygamy. For Muslims, it is limited to 4 wives. The Prophet is allowed, and the Prophet is previously married up to 9 wives. He is also prohibited from adding any more to that number, but those wives that he is married to, he is allowed to keep. And there's simple reasons for that. The importance of building tribal alliances. This is very, very important. The Prophet is not only a prophet, he's a leader of his people, and building those alliances is hugely important.
It would be entirely mistaken to imagine the Prophet basking decadently in a garden of earthly delights. These are political marriages. He marries Aisha because he wants to bind himself more closely with their fathers. He's creating a new community, not based on tribe or blood, but somehow this helps to make the transition easier if you make a marriage link.
We know from Muslim sources that some of Muhammad's marriages even caused him problems during his own lifetime. For example, when he married the divorced wife of his adopted son, his enemies spread rumors that it was an incestuous relationship in an attempt to divide the Muslim community.
His marriage to his former daughter-in-law, Zainab bint Jahsh, when he married her, it's clear that there were protests from the community, and people thought that this was a shocking, scandalizing kind of thing for him to have done.
According to the sources, Muhammad faced another marital crisis when Aisha went missing during a journey. She was eventually found and brought back to Medina by a man who had known her before her marriage to Muhammad. Again, his enemies spread rumors that something scandalous must have happened between them. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad himself was at first unsure who to believe, but eventually, after a new revelation from God, he accepted Aisha's protestations of innocence. At that time in Arabia, adulterers were traditionally stoned to death. This new revelation defined how any future allegations of adultery should be dealt with, and surprisingly, in complete contrast to the extreme views held by groups like the Taliban.
The punishment of stoning to death was borrowed from Christianity and Judaism, from the Old Testament, of course, as we know. In the Quran, punishment for having sex outside marriage is lashing 100 times on your backside. Only if it can be proven that 4 people have seen the act of penetration, which is very difficult to prove.
Muhammad's wives lived with him in specially built rooms adjoining the courtyard of his mosque in Medina. It was a very busy public place and privacy was hard to find. With the continual attempts of Muhammad's enemies to create division, the potential for future scandal was always there, so something had to be done. One day, Muhammad received a new revelation that instructed his wives to cover themselves to maintain their modesty. This act of veiling or covering has had a profound effect on Muslim women and also how the outside world views Islam's attitudes to women in general.
There are injunctions about the Prophet's wives wearing some kind of covering. It's not exactly clear what that covering is, but it's to distinguish them, and this is all part and parcel of the difficult divisions in Medina, because Muhammad's enemies in Medina were using his wives to discredit him, and so some kind of distinction needed to be made, but veiling was not for all women.
Today, the veil is seen by Islam's critics as symbolic of its attitude to women in general and its desire to oppress them. But the more universal veiling of women did not become an Islamic custom until more than 100 years after Muhammad's death.
As far as the religion is concerned, there is a requirement of modesty for both men and women. But how you fulfill that requirement is open to debate. You know, I don't feel that I'm compromising myself as a Muslim by not wearing the hijab, and I certainly don't not wear it because I'm trying to say I'm not actually such a serious Muslim. You can't judge the seriousness of someone's faith and belief by what they wear.
Over the last 20 years, in Britain, as in many Western countries, the veil has become a form of identity for many Muslim women. Some just cover their hair, others their entire face. It is a controversial issue, with some European countries now banning women from using the veil. Fatima Barkatullah is a writer on Islamic women.
But Fatima, are you wearing the veil because you're obliged to, because of your family, or do you do it out of free will?
For me, it's absolutely 100% free will. It's very much about a spiritual journey and about wanting to be the best I can be, in God's eyes. When I'm getting ready in the morning to go out, I'll just cover what I would normally be wearing, whether it's jeans or whatever I'm wearing, with something like this.
Which is a gown, essentially.
Yes, it's an outer garment.
Right.
People call it the abaya or the jilbab. And then I wear this, which is a khimar, or a scarf. And then I wear this small face veil. This is very much my public face, if you like.
But why do you choose to wear the full face covering as opposed to this, the khimar, the scarf, which you see a lot of other Muslim women wearing as well?
I believe that the more modest I can be, the more of a virtue it is. So essentially, I'm doing it to please God.
Where do you feel this comes from? Is it in the Quran? Is it in the sayings of the Prophet?
Yes, you'll find it in the Quran. The verse in Surah Al-Ahzab clearly says, O Prophet, tell your wives, your daughters, and the women of the believers, meaning the Muslim women, that when they go out of their homes, they should wear their outer garments. And the word in Arabic is jalabib, which has 2 orthodox interpretations, actually.
But that's the point. This is all in interpretation. There isn't anywhere in the Quran which says it is a rule for Muslim women that they must wear a veil. It's in the interpretation.
As far as the face is concerned, there is some difference of opinion.
The one verse that specifically does deal with clothing actually says cover your nakedness, not shroud yourself in a black bag. Now, Muslim women have interpreted it, Muslim men have interpolated